Okay, guys. So today, I had to think a lot about what to call this lecture because we're going to go in multiple directions. I kind of gave you a very broad readership as well as a few specific topics, such as what must you do if you want to compost at home, or what should you do if you want to grow at home, if you want to grow your own crops somewhere close to home. What should your approach be? But because we've looked at environmental sciences and the way any action that we have on this planet results on different changes in the interactions between different biospheres, and that biosphere and that entire interaction between the living and the non-living is practically the ecology or the ecosystem that we've been looking at. And today, by giving you examples from environment friendly practices of agriculture as well as non-environment friendly practices of agriculture, I'll basically be introducing you to agroecological systems that that make you think about what we're doing wrong or right in each practice that we have. So, of course, I'll try and compare the industrial agriculture, so everything past the agriculture revolution or the green revolution, not mentioning that, but kind of looking at what the essence of that was. And then also look at what is this conservation agriculture and what could that entail, to get a systems approach of things, which is something I think that's closer to the heart of the center rather than myself. Of course, I like to look at agriculture and agriculture systems from the perspective of a farmer as well, but I can't think broadly about a lot of other things. And we'll touch upon the environmental impacts. It was present in your reading, so I wouldn't go in depth there. But I think the other two things that have become more buzzwords, which I like to include in the discussions in environmental sciences, is the genetically modified food, as well as the pests and therefore the pesticides and how to manage them in a better way. And because now a lot of our cities have urbanized, there's practically no space for farming. And research now shows that the more green spaces you have, the better. Or the closer the food is to home, the better, because then the value chain is really, really small, and therefore the practical implications of that are really small. So now we'll look at how the cities have started farming. And the practice of farming can look very, very appealing, especially if you're trying to reclaim desert land and you're trying to convert deserts into green land. So the first picture that you see is of TOSHKA, which Dr. Mahmood's not here, but this is his area and region of interest because he spent a lot of time here. So it basically zooms on certain satellite images in the region to show how deserts being reclaimed or claimed to practice agriculture, and the water from one lake is being used for agricultural practices. So on the one hand, that looks really exciting. People would want to know whether this practice can continue to feed the 9 billion people that we say the planet will have by 2050, which is why we're going towards what we're going towards, intensive farming. And on the other hand, there are very sad stories as well, such as claiming land from rainforest or forests to because the land or the soil is healthy, to practice agriculture. And I have mentioned it with reference to a few other things, such as for biofuel. Now you're growing corn, deforesting, growing corn, and then making biofuel. So on the one hand, it's a healthy practice, but if you look at the consequences of it on the environment, it's also great. So you can look at it from multiple lenses, but the one thing that's obvious is that we are making spaces tight for wildlife or the life other than human life on this planet, and we're also only thinking about ourselves. So putting ourselves in the center, as we said in the very beginning. But what is this conventional agriculture or industrial agriculture or traditional practices of agriculture? It's basically looking at the food as an industry, or the food production as an industry, where you have certain input, and that input could be in the form of water, seed, labor, land, capital, machinery, energy, a lot of things that are going into your field and a certain process, and that can be agriculture or livestock. And that process would involve a lot of things as well. For example, if you're growing a crop, you would start from plowing down to harvesting. Or if you're growing livestock, then growing food for them to feed them, and then eventually creating that product as the crop and animal itself, or the products that we use for our luxuries that we would need out of that agriculture practice. And when this was initially designed, it wasn't designed with any other thought except for two maximizations: that we maximize the production as much as possible, forget everything else, and then we maximize the profit. So we make sure that it has monetary value to whoever's producing or consuming it, and also the production is maximum. So we have a lot of quantity. But of course, in such processes, when you're thinking only in terms of production, you kind of ignore the environmental cost that it could incur, because you are not looking at any other thing that could be damaged because of it. And I know we've studied all our lives that every action has a reaction that's equal and opposite. But I think in the case of environment and climate change, all of our actions have reaction that is so much more greater than our actions on the planet. So all of these disasters, all of these events that we're seeing around the globe, I think they are resultant of those smaller inactions or misactions that we have done on the environment. So practically, we're looking at agriculture, and in the process of agriculture, at a crop or a tree, we're looking at as a miniature factory. And we're expecting that miniature factory to produce, similar products. So if you speak to, for example, an airline company and say that I want to give you or sell apples to you, they would have their own requirements: this color, this size, this shape, XYZ numbers. So really it's about the production, the maximum production, but also production in the form of a factory. So that factory is producing identical products for you so that everyone in the airplane could have more or less the same kind, size, and type of apple. And that's not how nature works, right? If you've seen fruits grow in wilder settings, you would know that's not how nature works. It would grow at its own pace, in its own style, and would take the size that it wants to take. You can't ask a tree to grow all kinds of apple to be similar. And and of course with GMO that has changed, but that's practically the essence of conventional agriculture, and it practices 6 basic practices, which I've outlined here, but I would just look at them in the slides ahead. So first is tillage or plowing, which was initially done by hand. Now it's done by machinery. There is intensive plowing, such as the one that you see here, unnecessary, unneeded, or strip plowing. So you're kind of giving some gap to the land, but you're plowing it, you're reversing the soil, making the soil naked. And we know that topsoil is really rich in nutrients and biodiversity, because that decides what's going to grow in the soil, and that has most of the life. So all of the organic matter, the air spaces, the bacteria, the earthworms, all of them would be kind of lying in that zone, in that root zone, and allowing for a plant to have a healthy life, or allowing for a crop to have a healthier life. But with intensive agriculture, or with intensive tillage, or conventional or industrialized tillage, we have disturbed the soil. And we know that the soil is a sink for carbon dioxide. And every time you disturb the soil, you kind of allow the carbon to be oxidized and then released back into the atmosphere again. And then a lot of other activities, such as the water holding capacity that we discussed in the lithosphere, etc., and the water quality, the soil quality, they're all impacted because you're now changing how the soil actually was sitting there. And the other practices are monoculture. You've seen it even in Punjab. There are some places where when you go, no matter how far you see, you'd only see one kind of crop. And monoculture is generally not how nature works, right? So it's kind of going against the nature to grow only one kind of crop, because at the time of harvest, it would be easier for you to have maximum production of one kind of crop. And then we in the process, to increase that maximization, or to increase that production, we are using a lot of chemicals in the form of pesticides and also in the form of fertilizers. And we've seen them all across us, right? We see farmers just throwing these urea or ammonium fertilizers onto the land without really knowing what the demand of the soil is, and without really knowing what the demand of the particular plant is, and without really knowing what the quality of the soil is. So how do you decide how much inorganic fertilizer is going to go to the soil without knowing what the quality of the soil already is? And on top of that, to increase productivity, gene manipulations have occurred. And by gene manipulations, I don't refer to just the natural or conventional breeding, but also the genetic engineering, where naturally, as we discussed in one of the lectures, that the wilder and the domesticated siblings of plants have interacted between each other, and the seeds have evolved over time to be resistant to their surrounding environments. So that's natural breeding or conventional breeding. But what we do now with genetic engineering is we take it to the lab, take a certain trait that we like. So for example, fast growth, more biomass, pest resistant, et cetera. And then we would engineer that in the lab and then bring it back onto the field and make sure that the production is high. But above all of them, and I think I would refer you to an interview that I'd asked you to listen to of the irrigation minister of Punjab, who had kind of given you an understanding of how are the canals in Punjab designed to make it the food basket of Pakistan. So how were link canals designed to link the water-rich rivers with the water-scarce rivers, because they were divided between Pakistan and India after Indus Water Treaty. Before I move ahead, I only want to ask someone whether they remember or know from their Pakistan studies what kar is also called, I think, kanat in the Persian culture. Eamon?
Ma'am, I don't exactly have an idea about it, but I do know that it's like an underground sort of system that sort of, channelizes water. And it's like a really ancient method as far as I remember. But I had raised my hand to actually ask a question if I'm,
Go ahead.
yeah. So I was just wondering, you were talking about monoculture, right? So I was just wondering that why do farmers choose to practice monoculture when they can sort of yield more produce by planting multiple different varieties of plants?
Yeah, that's a good question, Eamon. So basically, anything to say in the offices in our buildings is easier than practicing it on the field. It would be easy for me to go to a farmer in Hunza and say, why don't you multi-crop at the same time? When he has such a small land, and on that small land, like they're already not growing a cash crop, and they're only subsistent farming, which means they're only meeting the demands of their family. And then the little that is left, they can sell, but they may not sell. And it's kind of the population that is there. You ask them, I'm not going to go and practice it there. So they are probably relying on their family system or their agriculture system or the machinery that's available there to practice whatever they're practicing. And if you have ever been to an agriculture field, if you belong to that kind of culture, you would know how difficult that life is. You would know how demanding that life is, because you're practically spending all the time that you have in the field to kind of take out the weed, water the plants, sow, plow, whatever. It is very time intensive. And on top of that, it's not, monetary wise, it doesn't serve them any good. So for me to just go and say, why don't you monocrop, is difficult. I think it should be done in Punjab, because in terms of land, they have a lot of land, but it's simply maximization of production of a single good. So it would be difficult for them to harvest one while the other is still there, right? So to make like a machine go and take and thresh and take the wheat out, or to kind of go ask for the machine to go and collect all the potatoes and bring it back, it becomes easy I think, when you have a monoculture. Or even otherwise as well, like even if it's manual labor, if you just have one kind of thing, it's easy to sow it, it's easy to harvest it, and that's why they prefer it. But yeah, you were right about kares. Kares is an ancient practice in Iran which traveled to Balochistan, where in hot and very the climates that we have in Balochistan, it was ideal to use an underground water transport system. So from a mother well to the following wells, where you made sure that the evaporation rate was controlled. Right. And then of course, you so that's an example. And then I think you've heard about sprinkler irrigation, drip irrigation. We always see it in many news. So I just want to mention them. You don't have to know too much about them because they're easy, fairly simple. Okay. So if that is conventional agriculture, then what is soil conservation agriculture, or soil conservation farming? I've mentioned a lot of terms here because they mean the same thing, and sometimes they could come in combination with each other. For example, the alley cropping that you see is also could also be called agroforestry, which is like growing trees and plants at the same time, so kind of mimicking the forest. It could also be called permaculture, right? Similarly, the windbreaks, where you're allowing for another layer to be on the side, could also be in a way called agroforestry. So a lot of these terms are kind of interlinked, can be used alternatively for one another. Just a simple change means something else. Terracing, which we know, we've seen in the mountainous areas in Pakistan, where you're not playing too much with what the topography of the soil was, and then practicing agriculture to make sure that there's maximum yield. And or contouring, which is in the natural systems, the river kind of takes the path that it takes, and in that process it creates a floodplain, it creates a watershed, it creates okay, so it creates, sorry, the messages always distract me. So it creates like a way for the water to stay longer in the environment that it's passing through. So contouring is kind of playing with the same idea to make sure that more and more water percolates into the ground, percolates into the roots of the soil to reach the roots. And whether you think of no-till farming, mulching, that is covering the soil, restoring wetlands, organic farming, practicing farm where there's no waste, practicing farming where the wastewater, which is the water that could contain fertilizer, doesn't leave the farm, etc. They're all kind of soil conservation agriculture, because you are trying to go towards nature, not really away from the nature. So you're not trying to change a lot of things from the environment. And because there are a lot of economists and business and finance people in this group as well, so I always have to think money too. So why food production systems, and how would you look at it? Generally, in any notes, in any books that you read, you would find the three terms, which is crop, land, rangeland, and fisheries, which is the main source of food for the entire planet. So cropland is basically the land that you claim to grow crops. Rangelands are generally pastures, feedlots, where you could grow your or rear your livestock. And fisheries, of course, is fisheries, whether that's in inland water or in marine setups. But in all of these food production systems, you have land, labor, and capital. And they could vary. And in the next slide, I'd kind of show you how, no matter how you change the one, by changing your input, you could change your output as well. And of course, the focus on food production in the area of food production is mostly on the yield, which is how much production do you have in an area. And I also mentioned types of agricultures there just for you to know that agriculture can be practiced only for a household, where they don't sell it to anyone, and that's called subsistence agriculture. So close to home, enough for the family to meet the nutritional demands of the family. But if they also have another system enough land for them to practice intensive agriculture to sell it commercially, then it kind of becomes traditional intensive farming, which is not just to meet their demands, but also to kind of let their food to go into the market and be sold and be profitable for them, etc., etc. And what we've done in the croplands is that So in a wilder settings, the crops were just growing, the plants were just growing. But in agriculture, we have domesticated them. And in the monoculture, we have made them, the minions. We've created minions of plants where every plant is similar to the other. And what has happened in the process is that they've become genetically less diverse, and which means that they don't have the ability to be resilient to the environment they're living in. Because in a natural setting, biodiversity or agricultural diversity or ecological diversity is a very natural thing. And we do all of that because we want food, fiber, paper, anything that we need in our life. And one of the things, the table that I've put, it's from a Canadian book, but basically there are a few major crops that are grown on most of the croplands. And remember, in one of the lectures, we had already compared industrialized agriculture and organic agriculture. I've only added a little bit more information about the livestock. So I just wanted you to revise it before we go ahead. I now have a question for you. There's one state in the world which became the first 100% organic state in the world. Do you guys know which state that is? Fateh, Nadia, is that to answer the question, or do you guys have another question?
Well, I wanted
I had
to
a question.
yeah.
Okay. So why don't we take Nadia's question?
Yeah, so my question was from the first slide.
Go ahead.
So you said that people are cutting the forests to make it available for agriculture, but I believe, or it's generally the land of a forest is not really suitable for this agriculture, because the higher plants take up the most of the nutrients around us and around it, and make it impossible or nearly harsh for the crops if we grow them there. So isn't it irrational to make the forest land available for the crops to grow? Because at the end of the day, the product is not going to be as efficient or as productive as we expect from cropland.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are multiple ways to do that as well, right? For example, it could be just the timber mafia wanting to reclaim timber. But I generally think that most of the forest land is suitable. So when you claim the land or reclaim the land for agriculture, you're kind of deforesting it first. So you're taking all of that away. So, and I think that land is generally suitable because that land has had life before. And if it has had life before and the life was diverse, that would mean that the soil would be healthier compared to many other soils. And like I said, when we go towards industrial agriculture, think of a monoculture system, right? A lot of something, or a lot of livestock rearing in that place. So let's say even if it was to take your livestock there and grow them and rear them there, and they overgraze. So it's not, so agriculture is not just crops, but also the livestock that we would take there. Both of them, I think, have an immense impact on the rainforests and the forest all across the globe. That grazing, as well as deforestation, as well as cutting down everything to agriculture's practice there, is the result of most of the damage that's being caused to the forests right now. But
Right.
yeah, I mean, there could be multiple ways to look at it, but I think this would be the most convenient one for the discussion that we're having today. Okay, who wants to answer this question? Thanks, Nadia. Who wants to answer this question?
Ma'am, can I?
Who's that?
Adeen.
Go ahead, Adeen.
Yes, ma'am. I once watched a documentary on National Geographic, I guess, in which they told that it was a state of India, and I don't know if I remember the name correctly, but it was Sikkim, I guess.
Yeah, that's correct.
And they said that now they they do not use any synthetic fertilizers or pesticides, and all their agriculture is 100% organic.
Yeah, So generally, these areas of the Himalayan footplains, or close to the land that borders with Bhutan and Nepal, etc., they generally practice organic agriculture. But of course, a lot of agriculture, for example, in where we are from, or generally most of the world, we are now slowly moving towards agriculture that is relying on fertilizers. And for them to kind of go back and have that 100% organic state. So everything that's coming out is organic, because otherwise there's a question, right? So for example, if I say my farm is an organic farm in Hunza, but the farm that's next to mine is using fertilizers, and the water that comes to my farm is passing through that farm, then is my farm really an organic farm? Because the water is bringing those nutrients to my farm. So there are like a lot of those questions that one can ask themselves, because when people think organic, they think completely compost or manure driven fertilizers. But yeah, so there are all those questions that one could think of when they think about organic agriculture. But I think this is remarkable. I think in 2016, it was the first state to become 100% organic state, and India in general has more organic farmers than most of the places in the world. So back to what we said about land, labor, and capital. The quantities of one could change, and of course, based on that, the output could change as well. And that's how we kind of define what intensive and extensive agriculture is, because you're putting a lot of something, or you have a lot of something to produce to maximize your production in agriculture. But kind of going back to the terms that you would see, whether you're a future political scientist who's writing papers for agriculture or agricultural future of Pakistan. The terms that you would often see on paper are, polyculture. So polyculture, let's say, is that if you move away from monoculture, which is an industrial agriculture technique, to what's more close to nature, which is polyculture, that a lot of plants or animals are growing at the same time, then you allow that crossbreeding, that natural crossbreeding and natural evolution and natural resilience to be built in those plant varieties. Or you could intercrop, where you grow one crop alongside the other. Or you could practice agroforestry, which mimics forestry. So you have these multiple layers or multiple canopies, where one could, for example, provide shade and reduce evaporation. The other could reclaim this space to stop pests from coming. One could act as we saw in one of the previous slides, a windbreak, because the wind can bring with itself a lot of pests or spores that could harm the crop as well. So all of these, I think, are terms that you must know, and I just wanted to mention them here for you guys to have a look. So 3 people have raised their hands if they could tell me what they want to know.
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to comment on the intercropping, yeah. So it's actually quite possible, and there is an excellent historical precedent for it as well. In the Aztec civilization, in the 15th and 16th century, they their main calories came from 3 crops: corn, beans, and squash. Now they planted corn to because their roots have this nitrogen fixing bacteria, and they planted beans, and they also served as a stocks for the beans to grow on. And then they used a squash to keep the moisture in, and also to keep the weeds out.
Right.
And the best part about this is that they made these artificial islands on top of their lakes, these beds, and they used to plant all this on them. As we can see, all this intercropping clearly tells us that it is possible and will save spending on artificial fertilizers and pesticides and all.
Absolutely, Fateh. And actually, I have this example with the Native American culture in some of the following slides. I think I'll mention it, but you've already given it, so I'll probably just flash through the slide. Rafi.
Ma'am, I just wanted to say or ask so we can try for polyculture and of obviously उसके benefits सारे reap कर सकते हैं लेकिन we're in a country जहाँ पे in most developing countries where we can't even fulfill the demand for the crops we need. So polyculture so we'll have like less land to do what we're already struggling to do.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to connect your question with what Fateh just said, right? That how you can grow 3 crops at the same time. And by the way, that system's called in the Native American culture, 3 sisters. So you grow 3 sisters together, where one is benefiting the other by providing it, a place to grow, a farm stand to grow. The other is fixing nitrogen for the plant. And the third one is stopping it. And in the process, you have 3 producers which could meet your nutritional requirements, so which could diversify your nutritional need or the supply that's given to the culture. So I think polyculture not only enhances or retains the quality of the health of the soil, but would also give you more nutritional choices to make. So if you're growing rice, then you could also grow something else along it. So if you're growing sugarcane, you could also grow something else along it. Where sugarcane has very little nutritional value, but it's extensively practiced in Pakistan. And who decides that, right? Which policymaker is sitting on a table to decide what Pakistan's growing right now, and how are all of these decisions made? That's a different discussion that we'll probably have at some point when we've covered these basic questions of exactly what it is. Yeah, so I didn't really answer your question, but I will try to make sense of it in one of the future slides. Now I'm touching upon something that I think is closer to the heart of Center for Water Informatics, where as well as I think generally in how we've tried to think in this class, where we're not looking at one system as an exclusive system. No, we're not looking at a farm as an exclusive system. We are looking at it, thinking about everything from sunlight, the available sunlight, to water, to waste, to then the humans or the human that is involved in it. So let's say if we just take the example of this FAO wheel for food systems, what do we want with all of this food production? We want poverty reduction, and we want food and nutrition, which is like the basic right. We looked at the SDGs, that's what we want. And then we are going to rely on a lot of these natural ecosystems. And in the process, there would be a lot of stakeholders and a lot of input, both natural and from the human world. And of course, a lot of diverse actors. So how does all of this policy regulation impact the natural world as well as the poverty? And food systems kind of looking at it all together at once. So not only would someone who's looking at food production, poverty reduction as like they won't be looking at the value chain only, or they won't be looking at the farm only. They would also be looking at the policy that is being made. They would also be looking at the trade policy that is being made, because that trade policy would decide what's being grown on the farm. They would also look at the subsidies that are being given to the farmer every year. They would also look at the seeds that are being provided to the farmer every year, because that would push the farmer towards making the decisions that they want to make. So if I'm a farmer sitting on the ground, and then the government is telling me that you have 50% subsidy on drip irrigation, 50% subsidy on fertilizers. If you buy these Euro fertilizers from us, you will get it on half price because government's going to take care of the rest. Then I would be obliged to kind of buy it, because I would think perhaps this is better. And then what if some seeds are coming free, a particular variety is being gifted to me by the government? Then what would I do with the seed, right? If I don't grow it or sow it in that year, I'd probably sow it the next year. So a lot of these decisions will be happening based on which world, global organizations, where the World Bank's investing, where the Asian Development Bank is investing, and they have a certain thought process or vision that they want to implement in the developing world. All of those are going to decide, how we look at things. So for example, if they're investing in renewable energy, then you would see renewable energy on my farm. If they are giving us machinery or subsidy on machinery, you would see machinery. If they're giving us loans for buying certain something, you would see the farmer inclining towards that. So all of these systems, whether they're health systems or farming systems, when all of the systems come together to just define exactly how are we going to make our nation food secure, would be looking at this, and that's why I keep telling all of you that your role in what we are discussing in this class is so important, because as a politician, you could make as much contribution into food security as I could as a scientist, right? Or any other biologist could. So that's why, like, every actor, every action, every policy, every system is important in this bigger, broader system where we want to uplift communities and make sure that communities have access to basic rights. And to kind of look at the similar thing where, we just looked at food systems. We weren't worried too much about sustainable food systems that would think about the environment. So this is just basically broadening up the same thing, looking at the value chain within the smaller economy, but also then diversifying it to the national market, and then eventually diversifying it to the international market. And in that process, looking at how the environment will be impacted. If you're transporting your food from your farm to the market, the local farmers market, or if you're exporting it to the US, what could that mean for the environment in terms of the water abstraction, in terms of the GHG emissions, etc. So it's just basically looking at your input as well as what, until the output, how are the processes impacting the environment. And of course, the more complicated or the more higher up the value chain you get, the more complicated or more impactful it will get. From the beginning till now, we've been trying to look at the capital, the natural capital that's all around us. We've discussed that soil is formed naturally. We've discussed that it's renewed. We've discussed that our water resources can purify themselves. We have discussed that air can purify itself. We've discussed a lot of things in this class, whether renewable or non-renewable. If not discussed, at least mentioned it. And we've also looked at how our gene pool is diversifying. The diverse the environment, the better, because then they will have the ability to naturally grow, evolve, become resilient. But if we move from nature to something that's, if we take things away from the nature, or our practices away from the nature, how a healthy soil, or how quickly a healthy soil could convert into a desertified or a desert land. And that there could be a lot of multiple, because of a lot of multiple human action, whether it's erosion, that is, if you've made the soil naked, and there could be water erosion, or there could be wind erosion. So how all of these actors come together to then make sure that your healthy soil or your healthy land converts into a desert could include a lot of things. And like we said, a natural soil has the capability, it has a certain compaction, air. So if an earthworm is traveling, how is it creating that tunnel that could provide space for other life forms to walk through, could provide oxygen for bacteria that are down there, could provide space for more water to retain in the soil. Similarly, the pH, how does that allow for the water retention capacity? How does that increase the water holding capacity of the soil? We've kind of touched upon it, but a lot of these activities such as overgrazing, intensive farming, intensive agriculture, erosion, deforestation, etc., could eventually lead for a land to become a desert. And then the goal that we want to meet, which is to provide basic nutrients to population, you wouldn't be able to have that. And then if we have depleted the soil of the nutrients that it contains, then we are going to put artificial nutrients into it, which is mostly in the form of inorganic fertilizers that contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, so the NPK. And then again, like I said, how do you calculate how much do you want there? So it could be organic, where you use manure or compost, or it could be inorganic, where you use the commercial fertilizers. We touched upon this in the slides, I think, on Sustainable Development Goals, where I told you how a lot of GHG emissions are coming from food production and wasting the food. Just to quickly look at how 50% of the land that is habitable is actually used for agriculture. And most of that land is, by the way, used for livestock, meat, and dairy. But because their food is also producers, so a lot of land is required to meet their food requirements as well. And that's why the footprint. But if you actually look at our calorie supply and our protein supply of the globe, it is mostly coming from the crops. So why do we then need so much land out of that agricultural land that we are using to grow livestock, to live an ecologically high footprint life, basically? To also quickly look at this, the GHG emissions we've already discussed. The only thing that's missing here is the waste. So it discusses how from the agricultural practice, when you're changing the land type to producing the animal feed, processing it, retailing it, packaging it, or any food that goes into waste, or however energy is being spent for it to stay on the shelf, they're all responsible for GHG emissions in the world. But here, I think with the help of these graphs, I also wanted you to make a decision on, or just think about different things. So for example, we've always, from the beginning until now, we've discussed how beef is really bad because it's, because of its the high water extraction, high energy, less energy, productivity, etc., etc. But just to quickly show you that your perspectives could shift based on how you look at a certain something. So right now we're looking at the GHG emissions, and of course, beefs look the worst and nuts look the best. Then we've also discussed how with agriculture, the nitrates and phosphates result in eutrophication. Again, beef looks the worst, and then apple and other fruits look the best. But if you look at freshwater extraction or freshwater withdrawal, for them, actually, cheese is the worst. So if you are living in a water-stressed region, and for example, here nuts take the second place. So a lot of, again, because some of you are in politics, and if there are lobbies, and if there is a certain lobby, and you go there with only your figures on GHG emission and a few other things, people can come with counter arguments and say, but with respect to water, your vegan diet is not going to help the planet much. So all of those discussions, basically just for you to get a perspective on how negotiations could happen in political sphere relating to environment. I wouldn't get into too much detail on this. We have seen in the discussion on lithosphere, biosphere, and the atmosphere on how air is being polluted. We've discussed smog and kind of talked about how the rice paddy burning could be responsible for that. And we've also looked at how water is polluted because of all of these pesticides, etc., as well as the coliforms that could come out of the livestock rearing practices. I just quickly wanted to touch on these. We've all, when we were young in school, looked at how when a soil is naked versus when a soil has vegetation, how the water, it has more water retention capacity compared to the other. This is basically a very short BBC clip that I would want you to go and see. It's research that's happening, I think, at Cranfield University, where they've simulated rain. So they would kind of rain this land where multiple kind of soil and soil coverings have been used, such as mulch, such as textile, or proper vegetation. And they basically look at the infiltration as well as the overflow. So the runoff, which the water that can't percolate and runs off and goes into one of these, as well as the water that infiltrates and then is collected in another, to see how the soil would react to that. Up until now, does anybody have a question? Go ahead, Eamon.
Yeah, so ma'am, since we've been talking about soil, right? So I was reading about EM technology, which is basically when effective microorganisms are added to the soil. And I found it really fascinating because, it sort of improves the soil structure and enhances the soil quality as well as the growth of crops. So I was sort of wondering if we could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, we will in the so there are a couple of lectures where after I've taught you industrial pollution and a few others, we'll talk about how we can bioremediate things. And in that bioremediation, how certain bacterial cultures could be used in wastewater or in soil to kind of provide that life back to where it belongs to take its action. But I have some very, very ethical and moral questions on that as well, because I think as human, as exploiters, if we continue to, for example, in the case of the Nala outside, if we continue to pollute it and then expect a particular plant to come and uptake all of those toxic elements, and similarly, if we continue to practice the way we practice agriculture, and then also, it's good because of course we have the brain and we can use it, but how long can we continue to exploit all other kinds of life for our well-being? I think everything's good in a balance. So as long as we're not creating some super bugs that would eventually harm us more, or maybe harm other forms of life more, I'm always stuck between how far can you go in using life to degrade life, especially if the pollutant is our creation, and especially if the pollutant is our wrongdoing. So I'm always like divided between the two, but we will definitely be touching upon this when we discuss bioremediation. Yes, Adil.
Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to ask that in one of the previous slides, in there was a graph in which it was shown that nuts were having a positive impact on the greenhouse gases, and it is difficult for me to understand it. How is it possible?
So we said that if beef or in general in livestock practices, of course for them, they eat more, they graze all the time. If you've ever seen a cow, they're always munching because they love to eat. And then they're ruminant, so they release methane gas. And then of course they drink more water, and they're relying a lot on environmental resources. So we generally think that in a field with their food source combined, they would be producing GHG emissions more. But if you think about the nuts, they're also, like I think Nadia mentioned, that they're also another higher form of crops, right? So if a particular tree, generally we think that those kinds of trees would be able to survive in places where there's little water. Perhaps that would depend on the quality. But I'm thinking, and that just so you know, we thought about the entire food chain. So if nuts are being produced in a certain part, let's say they're being produced in some areas in the rainforest or in the African states, and they use certain amount of water, and even though it's water efficient, the amount of water that's used in taking it to a certain place, or the amount of water that's used in washing it or drying it or whatever, is more, and or bringing it to a certain place is more than it would have. So that's why sometimes figures can be dodgy, and that's why sometimes you need to look at the entire value chain or the entire system to make sure that so the closer to home the better, but if it's going far away from home. So I'm thinking most of these nuts are going from one place in the world to another, and I think that would be the reason for it to be more water intensive. But generally, because they're trees, I think they should have more water consumption compared to the others. Yeah, but good thought. Okay, so genetically modified is basically just taking a certain characteristic. I'll share a TED talk with you of resurrection plants. There's a biologist who's working on using the characteristics of plants that can grow in the deserts. So basically they just die when the conditions are not suitable. And then as soon as it rains, they relive. So those resurrection plants, she's trying to extract the DNA and use it on their closest relative in our food system. And so when I send it to you before that, I thought I should discuss this of how, when, for example, if a plant requires less water to grow, you can take that particular gene and then take it to a vector, which is mostly bacteria, because bacteria has a plasmid, and insert it into that plasmid, allow for that bacteria to grow and multiply at a faster rate. As we know, bacteria have like in 6 to 8 hours that they have a log phase where they're like multiplying several times. And so you have so many copies of those, and then you can use those copies and culture them with the plant to make sure that you have that characteristic and now sent to the plant. Has a lot of pros, which are present in the picture that I've inserted from the book that I've given you, but also a lot of cons, because we're not, we are in a way playing with nature, and sometimes it's a lot of other things that are associated with it. I think quickly I wanted to give you an example of how, so this is a college in Oxford where in one of so the student accommodations are here, and while I was there, they were refurbishing those. My friend was living there, so I used to go there a lot. But when the refurbishment was happening, this land was, of course, not taken care of, and then it became such a beautiful wild patch because no one was taking care of it. All of the wild grasses just came and habited the land that, of course, essentially belonged to them. And past that, so once the refurbishment was over, the administration came and cut down the wildflowers. But then the students stood up and said, we like it better that way. And so now the LMH front chord is a set of wildflowers, which is good for the environment, for your eyes, as well as I think for the insects. So I just wanted to show you that. So, just what happens when you have, this is kind of a man-made garden versus a wild, a natural, let it grow the way it wants to grow kind of garden. But going back to the same discussion of how when you have multiple wildflowers living by each other's side, rendering the environment beautiful, giving a biodiversity or agricultural diversity that we are missing in the kind of artificial environments that we've created. I think I just wanted you to have a sense of that as well. And maybe we can campaign for something similar in Lams too. Right, and all of this, and from the beginning, we've been talking about pesticides, and what exactly are pesticides? Pest is an enemy to the plant or to the animal. It could be a herb, it could be a fungus, it could be an insect, or it could be rodent, or it could be other higher forms of life that would attack your crop and reduce your production. And so automatically you would do something to go against it. Now, pest management, or these herbicides and insecticides, they can be natural as well. So for example, sometimes a particular plant exudes chemicals from its roots that can protect another plant that is standing next to it. So that's like a natural defense mechanism for the plant. On the other hand, we have created a lot of synthetic pesticides that are used to kill the pest. And of course, it's good in many ways and bad in a lot, because ideally we would expect that the pesticide would just go look for the pest and then just kill the pest and that would be it. But actually, a lot of it has resulted in the accumulation of that pesticide in our food chain, and then eventually causing a lot of issues, especially with birth issues and cancer-causing agents. And what's an alternative to the pesticides? I've given you some examples. Naturally, you could just flush water and make the insects run away. You could use a lot of other things, vinegar spray, sometimes smell. A particular plant, a particular tree could be grown. And then now I think somewhere at the base, I have what Fateh said, which is the three sisters, where bean, corn, and squash are put together. And this is generally in the Native American culture. And basically what happens is one provides a space for the other to grow, the other fixes nitrogen for one, and then the squash kind of claims the land and stops pests from coming. So that way, it's a healthy, happy environment. And this kind of relationship where you're going towards nature and playing with nature to make sure that you don't use chemicals, this kind of situation where a chemical pesticide is your last resort. For example, with these locust outbreak, there's absolutely nothing we can do right now because they come in such large numbers. So how far could we go in naturally maintaining it? So at some point, eventually, we'd have to use chemical sprays to control them. But in an ideal situation, you use as many things from nature, as many less toxic chemicals from your surroundings to make sure you can control pest as possible. But what is happening now, as for example, we talked about the farming, we talked about the reducing the value chain, growing close to home to make sure all of those fossil fuels, transportation, GHG, all of those costs would go down. Our cities have become concrete jungles, and there's no space for us to grow anything close to home. But now a lot of restaurants in the US, particularly in New York, have these underground or these farmhouses or warehouses where they're growing, practicing vertical farming. I remember when we had started our undergrad, hydroponics had just started, so which is such an ideal thing. And I think vertical farming also had just started, but now they have grown at a scale where a lot of vertical farms are providing supplies to many restaurants in the US and many restaurants in Europe as well. So all of that space that we required, and because of which we're going and attacking our natural environment, all of the changes in the climate due to climate change that we fear could change our agriculture practices or reduce our crops. So for example, something that we said in one of the lectures where it rains at odd hours, the temperature is not suitable. It's making it difficult for farmers to decide when to do what. Those kind of things can be controlled in such a controlled environment, and you have more yield. And because it's vertical, in a little space, you could create a lot of product, and it's attractive. Generally, the youth, the younger generation, run away from farming, but now they're finding this side, research-driven side, more attractive. It's not just about growing crops, they're farming fish, a lot of other things in a similar environment as well. And also, I think in the cities, what they're going towards now is creating this meat-like product. So burger patties that are made from plants, but that look like meat or taste like meat. So I think this is very in the West. If you go to any of the countries, you would see that. I've pasted a few links for you to go and read and enjoy. Generally, there we would always look for the fair trade and the Rainforest Alliance certificate. These are the things that you look for in the products that you use. But there's something else that I always speak against, and I couldn't just stop myself from bringing it up again. And that is the fact that a lot of our agriculture is now using plastic. And this is now being called plasticulture. And we have, in a lot of lectures, kind of tried and highlight how plastic's dangerous for the environment, how it's raw, it's coming from the fossil fuels, or its raw material is fossil fuels, so why we shouldn't use it at all. But I think this is what it is. And I'll quickly finish and maybe give you some time to have a few questions, or I can see that there's a lot happening in the chat. I'm sorry, I get distracted, so I don't look at it. There is another term for the same things that we've been trying to talk. This was coined in the 1978, and it's called permaculture. And I think for people from the social sciences, they would like to know the fact that it was initially called permanent agriculture, and that coin was taken, that term was taken out, and it's now called permanent culture, because I think agriculture a lot of times is culture mostly. So for example, for us in the North, it's definitely culture. It's a part of our culture. It's part of how we live. It's a part of, how we divide our land into our future generations within families, and who takes care of what. Everything's a part of our culture. So it's permanent culture to address agriculture, but such that we're now putting the human at the center. And instead of taking our life away from the natural environment, we're bringing it close to the natural environment, where in your home, close to your home, you'll practice kitchen gardening, and then you'll increase the density of it, and eventually, slightly farther away from home, you'd have a more forest-like structure. And it's being practiced in many places, and I think it has proven successful in most. People call it different things in different places, but I really love the term permaculture, so I thought I will mention it here. I think we should, and all of you should discuss, or maybe we can do that in the chat box now, on where does the food that's coming to your plate comes from? Have you ever asked your sabzi wala, or have you ever gone to the market, you know, when they say this has come from Sagoda or this has come from elsewhere? I remember buying something that they said has come from Iran, I think banana. And I was saying, why do we need banana from Iran? But, you know, sometimes thinking on where does your food come from? Who's involved? How are they involved? And also, before we finish, smallholder farmers who own small lands, who are affected by the middlemen who buy things from them and take it to the market, or middlemen that provide certain facilities to them. That too, I think I want you to look at these links, some of the links from the World Bank, and think about small holder farmers. And like always, I am promoting my own village to give you an example of how certain technologies could be used together. So here you have like a hydro ram pump, which is using the flow of natural river to uplift water to a place where otherwise water wasn't available. This is a land that's been given to the women organization in the village. And this pump was, I think, gifted by PCSIR. So there is a storage facility up there, and then that storage facility is then connected to a drip irrigation system. And what was otherwise very barren now kind of looks green in the 2-3 years time, has been conducted with the help of ICMOD and OSED and many other organizations. And I just thought I'll quickly go through this for you to have a look and have a think about what's going on in the world. So now I think I can open the floor for you guys to talk about anything that you want to talk about. Hassan.
So I had a question from the start, but then we moved on. It was about biofuel, where because of COVID, a lot of the crops that we've grown have gone completely unused. Just recently, I watched a video where a lot of potatoes just had to be dumped because there was no demand